Toomey of Pennsylvania, member of the Banking, Budget, Commerce, and Joint Economic Committees. Is this the first time you've guest hosted?
I believe it is.
It's your debut. It's good to have you.
Well, it's great to be here. I'm a big fan of the show, so it's fun to be with you.
Jacket off, too. Yep. He's jumping right in.
I thought that was the uniform of the morning, right?
What does the budget debate look like from where you are? Is it dysfunctional, or is this part of the process that we get every time?
Well, I think it's a little dysfunctional when we have to pass these continuing resolutions, especially a 2-week funding period when we've still got through October to fund. But we're pretty far apart. You know, I think most Republicans, in fact, the vast majority in the House and my colleagues in the Senate, believe that a big part of what the elections were about last fall was about the need to cut spending. This is not a great revelation that I'm breaking this morning. I think it's pretty clear. It seems that many of our Democratic colleagues didn't get the memo on this, and so we're pretty far apart still. I'm hoping we can come together soon, but you know, we can't continue spending this way. We can't continue with deficits that are 10% of all of GDP, $1.5 trillion, $1.6 trillion deficit. So I just don't think we can kick the can down the road anymore.
You know, we're watching the NFL negotiations along with this, and when the NFL, when they agreed to the 24-hour extension, people thought, well, they must be getting somewhere, because they agreed to talk for it, and now probably more days. Is it the same thing? And because the stopgap goes till the 18th, that it's unlikely we'll actually see a shutdown?
It's hard to gauge the likelihood. I think most people don't want, I don't know anybody that wants a shutdown. There was one important sign of progress, I would argue, with the 2-week extension, and that was that the Democrats for the first time conceded that there needs to be cuts in spending. And for that 2-week period, the cuts are in proportion to the $61 billion for the full remainder of the fiscal year. So that was an important concession, and if it suggests that there will be common ground by going ahead with substantial cuts, then we can get there.
You say nobody wants to see a shutdown. Would you be willing to have a shutdown if it meant that your targets would be at least have a better chance of success?
I think that, you know, business as usual, continuing to run $1.6 trillion deficits, continuing to rack up the debt, that's probably worse. So I think a lot of us are going to be insistent that we get some substantial cuts. And frankly, before we raise the debt limit, I think we need process reforms as well, because we've clearly got a broken process. That this has been a chronic problem recently, and it doesn't, if you look at the president's budget, it's not going to get any better. So I think we need to take action now.
What kind of process reforms?
Well, for instance, I think we ought to have a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. We could make that a condition to raising the debt limit. Now, the administration's position is very clear. They want no conditions whatsoever, just raise the debt limit, keep on borrowing. Well, I think we've reached a point where the magnitude of the debt is already a threat, probably already impeding economic growth because of the risks that it implies. So I just don't think it makes sense to continue down this road without doing something different. I would suggest we could complement it with statutory spending caps. We've used them in the past. We're tough caps that say spending can't be above a particular level, and if they go above that, then there's an automatic sequestration of funds to bring them back down. I think we need that kind of fiscal straitjacket to get spending under control.
Should we be looking for cuts in this very small universe of potential cuts that don't include entitlement spending? It seems like a loser's game, but it doesn't seem like the Republicans are jumping up and down that we need to expand the area where we look for cuts. Everybody's afraid of the third rail of Medicare and Social Security.
Many of us are calling for broader cuts. Now, first of all, the continuing resolution, as you know, it's a very specific segment of the government that it funds. So that's what's available to be cut or not to be cut. And there are modest cuts, really. If you look at it as a whole, it's about 6%. If you look at it in terms of the non-security spending, it's about 10%. The people across Pennsylvania that I talk to think the government can probably wring 10% of savings out of most every program. A whole lot can go further than that. But you're right. When we submit a budget, which Republicans need to do, the president's done it, and he said nothing on entitlements, right? Completely abrogated responsibility.
Simpson Bowles. It's like the elephant in the room. But I see it with both parties. Nobody's talking about Simpson Bowl.
We're gonna have a budget. and I think you should judge the Republicans by the budget that we produce, and that's a fair standard. Judge the president likewise. He completely abdicated his responsibility to even address entitlement reform, to address fundamental tax reform, to do anything, and as a result, debt keeps growing, even as a percentage of GDP over time under his plan.
But Senator, how do you feel about these programs, these entitlements? Because we've seen polls recently that show Americans don't think that the problems are there, that they think we can get things under control by just looking at the areas you're looking at right now. That's not the case. How do you feel about this?
I'm prepared to give voters more credit than that, and I just came off a tough campaign in a big state and talked about this all the time, and I think voters realize that we do need to look more broadly than that. I don't think defense can be off the table, for instance. I mean,
so Durbin has a point. You can't just look at domestic spending.
Oh, it's certainly true that you can't just look at domestic, non-security, discretionary spending and solve the long-term problem. But let's also remember that when we went from spending of less than 20% of GDP during the middle of the second Bush administration to 25% of GDP last year, that was discretionary spending. So the big, huge surge was totally discretionary, and we need to bring that back down. Now, long term, we don't solve this problem unless we address Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and some of the other smaller entitlement programs. And I'm speaking with some of my colleagues right now about how we can address some of those programs in a budget that we're going to submit. So I think you're going to see, and I think in the House, you're going to see them address the big entitlement programs, despite the fact that the president didn't provide that leadership.
But Becky's question about sort of the political teeth that you're running into, even Speaker Boehner has said we need to sort of bring the American public around to some of these poll numbers don't lie, right? I mean, at least at some point, I think Boehner's words were they don't get it yet. They have to get it, but they don't get it yet.
Well, I also think it matters the way this is done. If you're talking about some kind of draconian across-the-board cut in Medicare, of course, that's not going to fly. But if you talk about some structural reforms that give people more ownership, give them some control, maybe you reduce to some degree some of the subsidies that go to upper income folks on this. You know, there are ways to address this that when people look at the specifics, they're going to say that's not unreasonable. Yeah. So I think you can make progress. I think voters are ahead of the political class on this. I really do. The voters I've talked to wanted to ban earmarks long before Washington ever got around to doing it.
Will you be willing to let the Bush-era tax cuts expire in a year?
Well, there's a second thing that's incredibly important to me, right? One is restoring some fiscal discipline, which I think has to come on the spending side. The other is maximizing economic growth. And if we raise taxes, we're going to diminish our potential to maximize economic growth. So I'm not interested in a tax increase. I think we should keep the 2003 tax cuts in place. I would actually argue for lower marginal income tax rates on business. As you know, we have the highest corporate income tax in the world. We choose to put ourselves at a systematic competitive disadvantage. I'd also advocate lower capital gains rate, and we have seen every time we've lowered capital gains rate that leads to productive investment and actually often a surge in revenue.
That's part of Simpson Bowles too. Doesn't everyone think that we can get rid of a lot of deduction and get the marginal rates lower? And I just wonder, and we keep harping on bringing back all the taxes here that companies are paying to foreign. It's just so frustrating to see. You know, Exxon pay $40 billion in taxes and almost all of it to other governments because, you know, they keep the profits offshore because of the high rates here. It's how much could we bring back in if we repatriated all of this?
So the estimates are that it could be close to $1 trillion. Right? It's in the hundreds of billions, and this is one of the things where the political demagoguery is just really outrageous, because as you've correctly pointed out, all this money is sitting overseas. Huge amount would come flooding back into this country and be invested in the United States, new factories, new plants, new jobs. But some on the left suggest that that's offshoring jobs if we lower taxes on those overseas profits.
They say that when it comes back, it goes to shareholders and CEOs.
Well, and shareholders are pension funds and IRAs.
I mean, maybe not CEOs, but shareholders, yeah, they perish the thought that it could be used to raise dividends.
Well, you know, and that's exactly what encourages capital formation and investment and risk-taking. So, no, I think we should have a territorial-based system where we don't sort of unilaterally among major industrial countries tax those overseas income. And by the way, we should also keep in mind the vast majority of subsidiaries of U.S. corporations that are operating overseas do so to serve a local market. You know, U.S. Steel has a steel plant in Eastern Europe. They make the steel and they sell it in Europe. They don't ship it back here. And so if we allowed them to bring that money home, they would invest it in the United States.
Carl, would you be okay with just not ever having to get that? What is that? You want the additional 3% on the people over 250? Is that what the 39.6 you want to go back from?
I haven't written my policy
All right,
paper.
but instead of that, how about we actually raise more revenues by getting rid of deductions for people that maybe a lot of people that make $10 million a year, people that make $1.5 million, people that have deductions, corporations, for across the board. But we actually bring in more, but you don't actually get that final raise back to the Clinton levels. Would you be okay? Or we got to go back?
What would Buffett say? What did Buffett say?
He says he didn't say 250.
No, he said
for
$1 or $2 million.
Yeah, as long as you can get money up. He's told me in the past too.
Or
if you can get revenues up, but if you get rid of the deductions and you do bring money, I mean, people look at these rates and it's only the suckers who are paying those rates.
Right.
So all these
Same
other
with
ones,
corporate.
the ones with money, people with
Lose
money,
the
corporations are
deductions.
able
So why
to
don't
work
we
their way around
redo that? Why can't we do that?
I think that's necessary, don't you?
I think we
Comprehensive
should
tax
dramatically
reform?
simplify. And as the Commission observed, if you do that, you can lower rates dramatically. You don't need to just keep them where they are. You can lower them dramatically. That encourages growth. Marginal rate reductions are very, very
But the key
pro-growth.
is some people in some companies are going to be paying more money in taxes under these if you get rid of these deductions.
Right.
So it's a
and
cleaner
you make
system.
it completely revenue neutral, they will.
Right.
And it would probably help growth, which would raise the pie that you're taxing.
Total revenue, right.
Senator, just going back to this idea of repatriating funds that companies have overseas, we've tried this before, and what was it, about 4 or 5 years ago the last time that we did this? And the concern at that point was the money was not coming back and being put into jobs use. It was named the Jobs Act or something. But because it was a temporary plan and because there were very few rules, money's fungible. Once you bring it back, you could do a lot of different things with it. The concern is you bring that money back and it doesn't necessarily get invested. Are there ways to make this a long-term change and make sure that that money goes back into investments here in America?
Well, as to the former, I think, yes, you can make it permanent. That would be the best thing to do. Because if you made it permanent, all you're really doing is leveling the playing field. Most other countries have this arrangement whereby overseas earnings are not taxed again. And so you encourage capital to come to the United States, corporate headquarters to be located here. I don't think we should then have a long list of all the things that must be done with it. I think we should allow boards and shareholders and managers to decide how to deploy that. But when they bring it back here, what else are you going to do with it ultimately but invest it?
I mean, it might go into dividends.
They go into dividends or share buybacks, or
which is for the investors who are American citizens who are
But the
holding
complaint that you hear is that this is only helping out the wealthiest Americans again, and not necessarily creating jobs here. I guess, is there a way to try and focus it on job creation and giving discount? Maybe that's cutting the tax basis for plants that you could build here with those money.
I think the way to encourage that it gets invested for job creation is to create an environment where people are comfortable taking risk again.
But
get regulations under control, have a tax regime that encourages risk taking.
If it causes the demand for the plants to be built and the people to be hired, then it works.
But if it's done in conjunction with lower tax rates for building plants here too, if it's something along those lines.
You don't just say you've got to hire all. That was like when the president said, I went in front of the Chamber of Commerce. You guys hire more people. It's like, that's how the government works.
No, but the former CEO,
hire more people without any demand.
of Dow Chemical has said one thing that they'd like to see is lower rates for the plants that you build here, because they can get much better rates if they build a plant in China or somewhere else.
There was an interesting piece in one of the papers over the weekend that one of the provisions of the tax compromise that the president decided on was 100% capital. You get to write it off immediately.
Right.
Yeah, so this guy was saying that there's going to be so much capital investment this year that it's setting us up for a bust next year.
Yeah. One of the dangers with these temporary things.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah.
We're going to talk a lot more. We'll talk some unions later on in the program. A lot still to come with Senator Toomey. He's here for 2 hours, Joseph.
If you have comments or questions about anything you see here on Squawk, email us at squawk@cnbc.com. Up next.